Well, good morning everyone, and thank you, Lou, for the welcome. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to come to Whangarei and especially to speak. And a lot's happened in 12 months, hasn't it? Is this new? I seem to remember last time I could hide behind the podium and now I can't. And I've got a year older, and a new man just turned up at church this last week and asked me if I had the gold card. And I didn't think I looked that old, but however, I did have my 60th birthday this year, and time does get by on us, doesn't it? As we sang for our last hymn that we just sang, Marvellous Grace, and of course that hymn was chosen because I'm speaking on grace this morning, as I often do. Although I haven't entitled my service that. I've entitled my service as Where is God? And by the end of the sermon, I hope that we will be able to tell or to know where God is. And I'm going to illustrate it, and you'll remember the sermon because you'll probably remember the story even if you don't remember anything else. This is a story about two young boys, aged about 8 and 10, lived in a small village, and as a small village goes, everybody knows everybody else. And these 8 and 10-year-old, the Mackenzie brothers, they were very mischievous young boys. They were always into childlike trouble. And so the neighbour just 2 doors down that had a nice hot house, a glass house, when a pane of glass was broken there and they found a little stone, looked like it had been shot from a Shanghai, they knew it was one of the Mackenzie boys that had done it. And a few more doors further down, the fruit that was on one of the fruit trees was just quietly disappearing day by day. And it was the Mackenzie boys that were doing it. And the lady across the road whose pansies had all nicely flowering and all trampled over because the Mackenzie boys had been over there retrieving one of their balls that had got into the garden. And it seemed like as things happened, these boys always seemed like somehow they were involved in it, until it got to the point where anything that happened in the little village, whether they had done it or not, it seemed like they got the blame for it. Mum and Dad were really quite upset about this. It seemed like they couldn't discipline their boys very well. And a new minister came to town. And he came with a reputation that he was very good in sorting out troubled boys and boys that were naughty. And so Mum and Dad went down to see him, and they said, would you mind seeing if you could deal with these sons of ours? They're getting out of control. They're always in trouble. He said, sure, and send them down after school. I want to see the youngest one first. And so after school the next day, about 3:30, the youngest one comes through the front door there and walks down to the front, and the minister's up the front there, and he asks him to sit down, and he sits in his chair and he looks him straight in the eye and he says, young man, where is God? Well, the little 8-year-old wasn't sure what to say, and so he just dropped his head and didn't say anything. And the minister said to him, lift your head up, I want an answer from you. And he raised his voice a little, I want to know, where is God? And the young boy still didn't know what to say, and so he just dropped his head down, and the minister became quite annoyed, and he stood up and he shouted, I want to know, where is God? And with that, the little boy sprung up out of the seat and shot back out the aisle, out the door, down the street, round the corner to his home, burst through the back door, through the kitchen, up into his bedroom and hid in the closet. And his 10-year-old brother had been standing in the kitchen, and he thought, wow, what's happened here? So he rushes up to the bedroom and he says to his brother, whatever happened? And his brother said to him, we are in big, big trouble. They can't find God, and we're getting the blame for it. It was Friedrich Nietzsche. If you've ever studied philosophy, you would have undoubtedly heard of that name. A 19th century atheist philosopher. And he wrote a book which was published in 1882 and had a funny title on it. It was called A Gay Science. Now, gay, of course, means something quite different to what it means today. But that was the title of that book. And in that book, he announced to the world and everybody who would read it that God was dead. And of course, this was after Charles Darwin had written his book, and the thought came around that God actually wasn't the creator God. And Nietzsche was now saying that God, in fact, was dead. Of course, he didn't believe that, because if God was dead, that meant he had been at some point alive. And he didn't believe that. Interestingly, it was Hitler that was one of his favourite books, who really was an atheist as well. So where is God? I'm going to leave that question with you just for a moment, and I'm going to look at a story from the Bible. And it comes from 1 Samuel chapter 16 is where we start, and actually we'll go back to the previous chapter, 1 Samuel chapter 15. It begins the life story of David. Now, David is a very important character in the Bible. He's mentioned excluding the Godhead. He is mentioned more times, in fact, twice as much as any other character in the Bible. 60 chapters in the Bible are devoted to David. If we go to 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see that Saul, for the second time, had disobeyed God in a very special way, and in a particularly obnoxious way. The Lord had told him to go down to battle against some enemies of Israel, told him to completely annihilate every man, woman and child and every livestock. And Saul did mostly that, except he brought the king back, as they tended to do those days, and he brought back the best of the animals, supposedly for sacrifices. And Samuel said to him, because you have done that, the Lord is going to take the kingdom away from you, and he's going to give it to one of your neighbours. Now, Samuel didn't want to give that message. It says he grieved for Saul for many days. And eventually the Lord came to Samuel and said, Samuel, how long are you going to grieve for Saul? I want you to get up out of your house. I want you to go down to Bethlehem, and I'm going to show you who the new king is. And so Samuel did that, and he went down to Bethlehem to the house of Jesse. And there Jesse, who had been pre-warned that he was coming, had 7 of his sons ready. And Samuel said, great, all 7 of them look great to me. One of them surely will be king. The first one, Eliab, came before Samuel, and he was a tall, good-looking, strong man. And Samuel thought, this is the man. And God said, no. And it's interesting, verse 8, he says, the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The man does not look at the thing man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And then the next one came along, Abinadab, and then Shammah, and worked their way down the line of 7 boys, and Samuel wondered what was happening. No one had been chosen. And Samuel said to Jesse, something's wrong here. Is there another son? And Jesse said, well, yes, there is, but he's too young to be a king. He's out looking after the sheep. And Samuel said, we will not sit down until he comes. And eventually David came, and the Lord said, this is the man, and he was anointed. Interestingly, David may well have wondered where his kingdom was. Okay, I've been anointed, where is my kingdom? And it seemed like the Lord said to him, your kingdom is back out with the sheep. And that's where he went and continued to look after the sheep. It's interesting what the Bible says about David. He was ruddy. That means he worked out in the sunshine. He worked outside. He had a suntan, fine appearance and handsome features. Now that's a good start for life in anybody's book. And this was good for David. Interestingly, he just went back out to look after the sheep. But before long, as the Lord had promised, he withdrew his spirit from Saul. And when the spirit of the Lord is withdrawn, it always leaves a vacuum in which the spirit of Satan is able to move into, which he did. And these black, dark periods used to come over Saul to the point where he couldn't function. And someone said, maybe if we can find a sweet singer or somebody very musical, it might help in your black moods. And one of the servants said, I know somebody down there in Bethlehem. He's really good on the harp, and he writes his own music, and he's really good at singing. And Saul said, bring him in. And of course it was David. And so we can add to fine looking, fine appearing, good looking. We can add to it a musician. It seems unfair in life sometimes. We were at school, you know, there was those kids that could do everything and had everything. They were good sportsmen, good at academics, wore the cool clothes, attracted all the girls. You know, it seems unfair, doesn't it? But it seems like David might have been like that. As we go on, we'll find that he had other attributes. And Saul took a great liking to him, but he didn't stay there all the time. It was only when he was in despair that David would come down and play music for him. The Philistines came up against the children of Israel in another battle, and it says they camped on one side of the hill and the Israelites camped on the other side of the hill, and there was a valley that ran between them. Neither of them wanted to give up their strategic position, because if they attacked the other side they would be fighting uphill, and so neither of them would attack. Apart from that, the Philistines had this huge man, 9 foot tall, that they were very afraid of. I guess he was like their armoured tank. And so for 40 days, Goliath would come down and he would challenge one of the children of Israel to come down and fight him. And he would stand down the bottom there and he would shout obscenities and he would shout blasphemous things at the children of Israel, trying to goad them to come down and fight him. Normally a battle wouldn't last 40 days. They were camped there for 40 days, and after 40 days Jesse said to his youngest son David, 3 of my oldest boys are there fighting and they're bound to be getting hungry by now. This battle should have been long over. Can you take them some food down, and while you're there, find out what's happening and bring the news back to me? David did go down there, and it just so happened as he arrived there, out came Goliath, shouting abuse and blasphemies. And David said, is no one going to fight this man? They said, well, take a look at him. Take how big he is. There is no man that will fight him. What's the reward for fighting him? David said. They said, the king has promised a big cash payment, no taxes on your family for the rest of your life, and his eldest daughter in marriage. Now, David wasn't really interested in that. He was concerned that the name of the Lord was being blasphemed, and so he began talking about it. Someone heard it, went to the king called him. The king recognised, this is my music man. And David said, I'm willing to go down and fight him. And so Saul tries to give him some armours and weaponry, and David said, no, that's all too big for me. I'll just fight him with my slingshot. We have a song that says, and one little stone went in the sling, and the sling went round and round. You'll know that song. Actually, they weren't little stones. A slingshot has a stone about 1 pound. Smooth, round stone about 1 pound. And if you read in the Bible, in the book of Judges, the men were very accurate with these slingshots. It says in Judges that there were 700 left-handed men that used slingshots in one particular army, and they all could hit their target within a hair's breadth. So if you were throwing, and these 1 pound smooth stones had the ability to travel at about 160 kilometres an hour. That's what they reckon. So if you've got one of these flying towards you and he's accurate within a hair's breadth, they're quite a lethal weapon. David clearly was very good at it, and you know the story. He went down there. And Goliath came to him with his sword and his spear. But David came against him in the name of the Lord and slew the giant. And a great victory happened that day. David went back to Saul's palace because Saul said, I need you to stay here with me from now on. You're the sort of man that I need round about me. And David increased in favour with the people at a very young age. He probably was about early 20s, about this age. It says that Saul put him as a senior captain in his army. And they would go out on army skirmishes. And he would always come back victorious. And one day he came back and the women were singing, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his 10,000s. And Saul remembered what Samuel the prophet had said to him, I'm taking this kingdom, or God is taking this kingdom away from you and going to give it to somebody more worthy. And he began to think about David. Good-looking, strong, brave, musical, a leader of men. I think it could be him. And he began to watch him carefully. He didn't give him his eldest daughter. In fact, David said, no, I'm not worthy to be married to you. I'm not worthy to be your son-in-law. Eventually Saul became, even though he was so good to Saul, Saul became so jealous of him that he gave him a detachment of 1,000 men and said, go and serve out there in the country somewhere. I don't want you round here, round the palace anymore. Interestingly, that Jonathan, Saul's oldest son, and David had become very close friends, closer than brothers. Also his younger daughter, Michal, she fell in love with David because David had been round the palace so much. And Saul thought, I know how I'm going to get David. I'm going to tell him that he can have Michal because he too liked her, loved her. David, if you can get 1,000 foreskins of the Philistines, 100, you can have my daughter. Hoping that he would be killed in doing so. David said, fine. And went out and he brought him back 200 foreskins. And dumped the horrible results of that at Saul's feet and said, there you are, I've done it. And Saul had to give his daughter in marriage to him. Things went from bad to worse there, and eventually, after Saul had thrown a spear at David twice in an effort to kill him, David had to leave, and he became a fugitive, had to leave his wife, his home, his job, his position in the army. And for the next about 7 years, spent it in the wilderness. Other fugitives and criminals and people who had misfits in society came to join him out in the wilderness, and there was about a band of 600 men. Finally, when David was about 30 years old, the Philistines again came up against Saul. And in the ensuing battle, Saul died, and also Jonathan, his son, and many other Israeli soldiers. And finally, David thought, at last, I have been waiting patiently in the wilderness all of these years. At last, thank you, Lord, you have given me the kingdom. But it wasn't so. His own people accepted him. The tribe of Judah said, we will make you king of Judah. The rest of Israel had forgotten their war hero. And they wanted Saul's son to be their king. But it says for the next 7.5 years, the house of David fought against the house of Saul, and the house of David became stronger and stronger. And eventually, at the age of 37, David became king over all of Israel. He immediately wanted to change his capital from Hebron and changed it to Jerusalem. He defeated the Jebusites and took their wonderful fortified city and made that his capital city. He expanded his borders further and further. He built himself a lovely palace. And the people and the neighbouring countries round about wanted to support him and show them their support for what he was doing. And they sent him cedar and they sent him marble and they sent him gold of which to adorn his palace. And finally, David had expanded his boundaries up to the Euphrates River, north past Tyre and Sidon. Gold and money were coming in. And one day David was sitting down thinking of how great God had been to him. And he thought, one thing is missing. I wished my friend Jonathan was here beside me. And then he remembered. He had made a promise to Jonathan shortly before he died. Jonathan had said, if I don't make it, I know you're going to be next king. Will you look after my family? Will you make sure that my family name survives? And David promised that he would. Up until now, David had been so busy with his kingdom that he hadn't even thought to put that promise into action. And so he called his servants in. And he said, is there any from the house of Saul still alive? And so the servants went out and scouted around, and they came back and said, yes, there is. And we've found one of Saul's old servants, Ziba. And David said to Ziba, is any of the household of Saul still alive, particularly Jonathan's household? And Ziba said to him, yes, there is one still alive. His name is Mephibosheth, but he is crippled in both legs. Why did he tell him that? Why was that important? He told him that because when a king wants to know if any other person is the rightful heir, as Mephibosheth was, he was the grandson of Saul through the eldest son, he, through hereditary, had the right to the kingdom. And usually when king found those things out, they would kill off all of those people, a bit like Herod. when the wise men came to him and said, "Go and find him and bring him back so that I may worship him too." Maybe David was doing the same thing. Bring Mephibosheth in so that I can show him favour. That might make a good TUI ad. Yeah, right, they were saying. However, David said, Mephibosheth. So where does he live? He lives in Lo-debar. Now that was a long way from Jerusalem, out on the outskirts by the desert. And the very name tells you where it might have been. Lo means no, Debar means pasture. He lives at a land called no pasture. Why was he living out there? So that he couldn't be found. He was a long way from the seat of power. David sent his soldiers out to Lo-debar. He said, I want you to bring that man back. I want to show him great favour. And so the soldiers went out there to the edge of the desert, where the cattle never grew fat, where the crops were never good. He could only eke out an existence, a former prince that now was just making a living. He had married and he had one boy called Micah. And the soldiers knocked on the door and his wife answered the door and they said, "We're looking for Mephibosheth." And her heart sunk. She was hoping this day would never come. They'd finally found him. And so they took Mephibosheth with them back to Jerusalem. And on the way, he looked at the things that once were special to him. And as they got close to Jerusalem, he began to marvel at the things that he'd seen. You see, when his grandfather had been king, when he was 5 years old, he could remember the little palace that Saul had. And he looked up at this great palace that David had. Jerusalem wasn't even controlled by the Jewish people at that time. That was owned by the Jebusites. He'd never seen this city before, certainly not inside it. And as he walked up the marble steps, he didn't walk with his crutches. He hobbled up the marble steps and down the cedar-lined hallway, and he thought, I don't belong here. I know that I was born a prince, but I don't belong here. And he made his way into the throne room, and he says he fell down in front of David. He knew that this was not his place. And suddenly he heard what I call a yes voice. Mephibosheth, stand up. And he stood up and he looked up into David's face, and it's what I call a yes face. And suddenly his fears that he had had on all that journey were dispelled and gone. Let me explain to you what a yes face is. I saw some this morning as I was coming in. This is a story about a president, and not President Washington. This was a story about President Abraham Lincoln. And he was travelling cross-country with a group of men on horseback. And there was a wayfaring stranger also that was wandering across, and the wayfaring stranger got to this what usually was a little river, little stream that he would normally walk across, but there had been a little bit of rain and it was a bit in flood. And so he thought he'll wait till some horses come along and he'll catch a ride across so that he didn't get wet. Well, eventually this group of men, which had the president in the group, came along, and he just stood there by the water's edge and watched the men. He looked into their faces as they came past, and finally got near the end of the group, and he said to one of the guys there, one of the gentlemen, "Would you mind taking me across the creek?" And the rider said, "Sure," and he put down his hand, gave him a hand up, and he hopped on the back of the horse and took him safely across the creek. He dismounted on the other side, and the group gathered around, and one of them came up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, but why did you ask the President of the United States for a ride on his horse?" The man said, "I didn't know it was the President. I was just looking for a yes face. And I saw his face, and so I asked him." Is there anybody here for the first time today? Yes, I can see one hand. Now, I'm not going to ask you to answer, but did you see yes faces when you walked through the door this morning? I'm going to digress just for a moment. I read an article in the Record, 4th of February this year. And in the Record, the division president was writing a little editorial. And he gave statistics, worldwide statistics, of how many people leave the church. In Papua New Guinea, 69% of the people that walk in the front door walk out the back door within 10 years. More than 2/3 of baptised people leave the church within 10 years in Papua New Guinea. It's really sad, isn't it? So it's a whole lot better here, isn't it? In the New Zealand Union, and they had the figures for that. Not a whole lot better. 64% of people who walk through our door in the New Zealand Union leave within 10 years. And he didn't say why it was, but might I suggest there's not enough yes faces in our congregation. Not enough people who are willing to get beside other people and nurture them. Now, I know that doesn't happen here in Whangarei, and it doesn't happen in Fielding. We need to make sure it stays that way. We need to nurture the new people that come in. Very few of them leave because of doctrinal reasons. They leave because they haven't been nurtured. They haven't seen enough yes faces. And so David says to Mephibosheth, "Stand up, Mephibosheth. I'm going to restore to you what used to be yours. You know, all those lands that your grandfather had, Saul's estates, you're going to get all them back. I want you to bring your family up from Lodi Bar, and I want you to come and live up here, but I don't want you to go and live on the estate there. Your servant Ziba will look after that. I want you to come and live here in my household. And over and above that, I want you to come and dine with me and have meals with me. In fact, I'm going to adopt you as my son." I want to paint a word picture to you now. I want you to imagine David's dining hall. And there in the middle is a great long table and a lovely tablecloth with tassels that hang right down to the floor. And on this particular day, David is sitting at the head of the table. It's not the way it's usually done, but he wants to observe all the guests as they come in. And the first guest to come in for the evening meal is wily old Joab, David's very trusted general, a clever man, a strong man. You can see by the look of him, he's been out in the sun for many years. Muscular, and a slight steely glint in his eye. And he comes through the doors and he sits close to David, and they begin talking with each other like a friend would talk to another friend. The next one to come through the doors, Amnon. That's David's eldest boy. He's very proud of him, and he comes in, you can see that he's got quite a bit of pride, this young man. And David looks at him, he can see that there's a little bit of arrogance with that young man. And it hurts David because he knew that he hadn't brought his son up the way that he should have. And then bursting through the entry doors again is another son, Absalom. And he's got a whole crowd of people around him. He's a real crowd pleaser, this son, with his beautiful long hair. And beside him is his equally beautiful sister, Tamar. And then another person walks in. It's one of David's many wives, one of his most recent wives. She's dressed up especially. She must make an impression. With about 300 other wives, the chances of getting another meeting are not good. And she must make a good impression on David. And she comes and sits on the other side of David. And it seems like everybody has gathered at this dining table, except there's one spare seat. And David doesn't let them start because there's still one more to come. And they hear him before they see him as he clomp, clomp, clomp the wooden crutches on the marble floor. And he comes through the door, and Mephibosheth is embarrassed. He wished that he had come earlier. He hoped that there was a seat at the end of the table that he could quietly slip into, but there is none there. And David sees him and beckons him to come up, sit beside him. And so Mephibosheth clomp, clomp, clomp up the dining table to where David is seated, and servants come and they take away those ugly crutches and they hide them behind the curtains. And they help him into his seat as he sits down on the right-hand side of King David. And as he sits down, the tassels from the tablecloth fall over his deformity, and suddenly he realises he looks as good as everybody else. It can't be seen that he is handicapped and crippled anymore. The tablecloth of grace has covered his deformities. And I want you to look around that table this morning, because somewhere in that table is you and I. And you might think you're that wily old Joab, or you might think you're that exotic queen. In actual fact, none of us are any one of those. We're all a Mephibosheth. Because you see, a long time ago, Mephibosheth received his lameness when King Saul was killed, and his nurse, in her hurry to rush him out the door and to go into hiding because she didn't know what the result would be, she dropped him. And what was once been a healthy little boy crippled his feet and paralysed him or crippled him for the rest of his life. You see, one time we were born into royalty. That was Adam and Eve. And a wicked person came along, Satan, and stole our kingdom from us. And from that point on, we have been sent to a land called Lo-debar. Oh, we can exist there. And we do. And sometimes we even think it's fun. But one day a call from the king comes and says, I want you to come to my palace. I want you to come into my presence. Now, the difference in this story is that we can reject that call. Mephibosheth probably didn't have the option. The soldiers were there and they took him. We can say, no, thank you, I quite like living in Lo-debar. Or we can accept the challenge and go into the king's presence. And when we come into the king's presence, we see how inadequate we are. And we prostrate ourselves on the floor. And then we hear the yes voice of God, and he says, lift up your head. Your sins are forgiven. I offer you grace. I'm going to restore you to what I once made you to be. And so I come back to the original question, where is God? God is still where he has always been, sitting at the head of the table of grace, waiting to let that tablecloth of redemption and forgiveness flow over your deformities and save each one of you. May you respond to that call this morning. Thank you. A final hymn has been chosen for us now.